August 15, 1945, Victory over Japan Day. Across America, fireworks lit the night sky and jubilant crowds filled city streets in celebration. In prisoner of war camps from California to Wisconsin, Japanese soldiers and auxiliary personnel prepared for repatriation to their defeated homeland. But in a modest facility at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, something unprecedented was unfolding. When American commanders announced to a group of Japanese women prisoners that they were free to return home, many of them did the unthinkable. They begged to stay. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the Japanese Women's Volunteer Labor Corps captured during the final months of the Pacific War. Young women who had served the empire in various capacities, now facing a choice that would define the rest of their lives. What could possibly make someone choose to remain in enemy captivity rather than return to freedom in their own country? Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story centers on 24-year-old Takahashi Ayame, a former communications officer from Yokohama. She had joined the Women's Corps in 1943, believing she was serving her nation's honor and protecting her family. Now, standing in an American prison camp, she clutched a small silk pouch containing the only remaining connection to her previous life, a photograph of her parents and younger brother taken before the war consumed everything. Beside her stood Nakamura Momoko, a medical assistant from Osaka, and Hayashi Suzume, a former radio operator from Tokyo. Together with 47 other Japanese women, they had spent the past 7 months in American captivity. What they experienced during those months had fundamentally altered their understanding of everything they had been taught about their enemies, about honor, and about what it meant to be human. The transformation began with something as simple as a meal, pork chops and applesauce. To American soldiers, it was ordinary comfort food, nothing special. To Japanese women who had been taught that Americans were barbaric devils who would torture and starve their prisoners, that first dinner service had been nothing short of miraculous. It was a moment that shattered propaganda and opened the door to a journey none of them could have imagined. Now, as Captain James Mitchell stood before them with repatriation orders in hand, Ayame felt her heart racing. Around her, she heard quiet sobs from some of the women. Others stood in rigid silence, their faces masks of conflicting emotions. They had all received letters from the International Red Cross in recent weeks. Most brought devastating news: families dead in firebombing raids, cities reduced to ash, a homeland that no longer existed as they remembered it. But more than fear of what awaited them in Japan, these women had discovered something in American captivity that many had never experienced before. Dignity, kindness, the possibility of redemption. And now they faced an impossible choice that would shock their captors and challenge everything both nations believed about loyalty, honor, and home. January 12, 1945. The transport truck rumbled through the snow-covered Wisconsin landscape, carrying its cargo of defeated enemies toward an uncertain fate. Inside, 50 Japanese women sat in rigid silence, their faces betraying nothing of the terror churning beneath their carefully maintained composure. They had been captured in the Philippines during the American liberation, serving as communication specialists, medical personnel, and administrative staff for the Imperial Japanese Army. Takahashi Ayame pressed her face against the cold metal of the truck, watching the alien winter landscape pass by. She had never seen so much snow. Yokohama had winter, but nothing like this endless white expanse that seemed to swallow the world. Beside her, Nakamura Momoko gripped her medical bag with white knuckles, the only possession she had been allowed to keep. Hayashi Suzume sat across from them, her eyes closed in what might have been prayer or simply exhaustion. The women had spent 3 weeks in transit from the Pacific Theater, first by ship to California, then by train across the continent. During that journey, they had prepared themselves for what they believed awaited them: The propaganda had been clear and consistent throughout their service. Americans were devils who showed no mercy to prisoners. They would be tortured, starved, and humiliated. Some of the women had sewn small packets of poison into the linings of their uniforms, determined to choose death over dishonor. When the truck finally stopped, the women were ordered out into the biting January cold. They stepped down onto frozen ground, their thin uniforms providing little protection against the Wisconsin winter. Before them stood a modest compound surrounded by wire fencing, wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, and guard towers at each corner. It looked almost exactly like the prison camps they had been warned about. Captain James Mitchell, the camp's commanding officer, stood waiting with several guards and his assistant, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of the few female officers in the U.S. Army assigned to oversee prisoner facilities. Mitchell was a tall man from Montana, weathered by years of military service, but possessing kind eyes that seemed at odds with his stern military bearing. Lieutenant Chen, whose parents had emigrated from Guangdong Province, understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion, based solely on appearance. Mitchell surveyed the shivering women before him and felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. They looked so young, so vulnerable in their inadequate clothing. These were supposed to be the fearsome servants of Imperial Japan, but all he saw were frightened girls far from home. He nodded to one of his sergeants, Corporal David Reeves, a farm boy from Iowa, who had requested this assignment specifically because he believed in treating all prisoners with basic human dignity. The women were processed quickly and efficiently. Their few belongings were cataloged, their names recorded, and their health assessed by the camp physician, Dr. Robert Hayes, who noted with concern how many showed signs of malnutrition and exhaustion from their long journey. The Japanese women were led into the camp's dining hall just as evening approached. Ayame walked with mechanical precision, her military training keeping her spine straight despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. The room was warm, heated by large stoves that radiated blessed warmth after hours in the freezing Wisconsin air. Long wooden tables stretched across the space, and the women were directed to sit. They obeyed in silence, arranging themselves on the benches with the same rigid discipline they had maintained throughout their service. Ayame sat between Momoko and a quiet woman named Tanaka Natsu, a former clerk from Nagasaki. Across from them, Suzume kept her eyes downcast, her hands folded in her lap. None of them knew what to expect. In their training, they had been told that American prisoners received barely enough food to survive, that meals would be punishment rather than sustenance. Then the kitchen doors opened and American soldiers began bringing out trays. The aroma hit them first, rich and savory, completely unlike anything they had anticipated. Ayame felt her stomach clench with involuntary hunger. She had not eaten properly in days, none of them had. The rations on the transport ship had been minimal, and fear had stolen what little appetite remained. Corporal Reeves approached their table carrying a large platter. With careful movements, he began placing plates in front of each woman. Ayame stared at what had been set before her, unable to process what she was seeing. A thick pork chop, browned and glistening with juice, a generous mound of creamy applesauce, mashed potatoes with a pat of butter melting into them, green beans, a slice of bread. It was more food than she had seen on a single plate in months, perhaps years. Around her, she heard sharp intakes of breath from the other women. Momoko's hands trembled as she looked at her plate. Suzume's eyes had gone wide with shock. Further down the table, she saw Yamamoto Kiku, a young woman from Hiroshima, cover her mouth with both hands as tears began streaming down her face. This had to be a trick, some cruel American joke. Perhaps the food was poisoned, or perhaps they would be allowed to look at it, but not eat. A psychological torture designed to break their spirits. Ayame glanced toward Captain Mitchell, who stood near the entrance watching them. He caught her eye and made a simple gesture, raising an imaginary fork to his mouth. "Eat." Still, none of them moved. The women sat frozen, staring at plates of food that contradicted everything they had been taught to expect. Corporal Reeves returned with a pitcher of water, filling cups at each place. His movements were gentle, almost apologetic, as if he understood the shock he was witnessing. Lieutenant Chen stepped forward, speaking slowly in English that none of them fully understood, but her tone was clear, warm, and encouraging. She too made the gesture to eat, then smiled. Ayame was the first to move. With trembling hands, she picked up her fork, half expecting someone to strike it from her grasp. Instead, she watched Corporal Reeves nod encouragingly. She cut a small piece of the pork chop, raised it to her lips, and tasted it. The flavor exploded across her tongue, rich and savory, with a hint of sweetness from the applesauce. It was real. It was food. Generous, warm, genuine food. Around her, other women began to eat, some with hesitant bites, others with sudden desperate hunger they could no longer contain. Momoko tried the applesauce first and made a small sound of surprise at its sweetness. Suzume ate methodically, tears streaming silently down her face as she chewed. Within minutes, the dining hall filled with the quiet sounds of 50 women eating their first real meal in enemy captivity. Ayame watched the American soldiers moving through the room, refilling water cups, asking in simple gestures if anyone wanted more food. Their faces showed no cruelty, no mockery, only what appeared to be genuine concern. It made no sense. This contradicted every piece of propaganda she had internalized during her service. Americans were supposed to be demons, barbarians without honor or compassion, yet here they were, serving generous portions of their own food to enemy prisoners. That night, lying on a real mattress with actual blankets in the heated barracks, Ayame could not sleep. Her mind replayed the evening over and over, trying to reconcile what she had experienced with what she had been taught. Beside her bunk, she heard Momoko whisper in Japanese, "Why would they feed us like that? What do they want from us?" No one had an answer. In the darkness, Ayame heard quiet crying from several bunks, the sound of women whose entire worldview had been shaken by something as simple as pork chops and applesauce. The small kindnesses continued in the days that followed. When Natsu developed a severe cough from the cold Wisconsin air, Dr. Hayes personally examined her and provided medicine without hesitation. When several women struggled with the heavy winter, Lieutenant Chen arranged for proper coats and boots to be distributed. Corporal Reeves noticed that Kiku seemed particularly withdrawn and began leaving small sketches on her bunk, simple drawings of birds and flowers that required no shared language to communicate kindness. Guard Sergeant Thomas Walsh, whose own daughter was about the same age as many of the prisoners, started a routine of morning tea service. He had learned from Lieutenant Chen that Japanese culture valued tea, so he began each day by preparing hot tea for the women, serving it with quiet dignity that acknowledged their humanity despite their status as prisoners. These gestures chipped away at the certainties the women had carried. Ayame found herself observing the American soldiers with growing confusion and something that felt dangerously like gratitude. February brought deeper snow and unexpected transformation. The initial shock of American kindness had given way to cautious curiosity on both sides. Lieutenant Chen, recognizing an opportunity for genuine connection, organized informal English lessons in the evenings. To everyone's surprise, nearly 30 of the Japanese women volunteered to attend. Ayame discovered she had an aptitude for languages that her previous education had never fully developed. She absorbed English phrases with surprising speed, practicing pronunciation until her tongue could wrap around the unfamiliar sounds. Natsu, despite her quiet demeanor, proved to be an excellent teacher of Japanese in return. Soon, simple exchanges filled the compound. "Good morning," "Thank you," "Please." Words that built bridges between former enemies. The dining hall became the heart of this cultural exchange. Mealtimes evolved from silent, tense affairs into something approaching community. Corporal Reeves learned to say oishi when the women complimented the food, his pronunciation terrible, but his effort genuine. The camp cook, Sergeant Michael Romano, from New York's Little Italy, became fascinated when Momoko offered suggestions about seasoning after watching him prepare vegetables. One evening, Romano invited Momoko and two other women into the kitchen to demonstrate Japanese cooking techniques with available ingredients. The result was a hybrid meal that satisfied neither Japanese nor American culinary traditions perfectly, but represented something more important than authenticity. It was collaboration, creativity, born from mutual respect rather than suspicion. Suzume, who had been among the most withdrawn prisoners, began helping in the camp infirmary alongside Dr. Hayes. Her gentle manner with sick prisoners, both Japanese and the occasional American soldier who fell ill, revealed a calling she had never been allowed to pursue in Japan's strictly regimented military structure. Hayes recognized her natural talent and began teaching her basic medical procedures, communicating through gestures and Lieutenant Chen's translation. The breakthrough came during a particularly harsh snowstorm in late February. The power failed in one of the barracks, leaving a dozen women without heat in sub-zero temperatures. Captain Mitchell immediately ordered the women relocated to the heated recreation hall for the night. But it was what happened next that truly shocked everyone. Corporal Reeves and several other soldiers spent the entire night working in the brutal cold to restore power to the barracks. When Ayame woke the next morning and learned what the Americans had done, risking frostbite to ensure enemy prisoners had warmth, she felt something crack inside her carefully maintained emotional armor. She found Reeves that afternoon, exhausted, but warming himself by the mess hall stove. With halting English and gestures, she tried to express her gratitude. He simply smiled and said, "Your people, same as us. Cold is cold no matter what uniform you wore." That simple statement haunted Ayame for days. People, same as us. It was a radical idea that contradicted everything she had been taught about the fundamental differences between Japanese and Americans, between the righteous and the barbaric. March brought the first signs of Wisconsin spring and news that would shatter the fragile peace the Japanese women had found. Camp McCoy received regular newspapers and radio broadcasts, information that Captain Mitchell decided should not be hidden from the prisoners. What unfolded in the pages of American newspapers and crackling radio reports forced the women to confront truths they had never imagined. Lieutenant Chen translated carefully, her voice steady but compassionate, as she read accounts of American forces advancing across the Pacific. The reports spoke of Japanese military actions that the women had never heard discussed in their service: brutal treatment of civilians, forced marches, systematic atrocities in occupied territories. The propaganda they had been fed described Japanese forces as liberators bringing prosperity to Asian nations. These American accounts told a horrifyingly different story. Ayame sat in the camp library, hands trembling as she looked at photographs in Life magazine. Images of emaciated prisoners liberated from Japanese camps, accounts of the Bataan Death March, stories from captured Allied soldiers describing conditions that made her stomach turn. Her mind struggled to reconcile these reports with her understanding of Japanese honor and military conduct. Momoko found her there, tears streaming down both their faces as they read together. "How much of this is American propaganda?" Momoko whispered in Japanese. But even as she asked, doubt colored her voice. They had spent months now among these Americans. They had seen the consistency of their kindness, the authenticity of their compassion. Would people capable of such sustained humanity lie so completely about their enemies? The question haunted all the women. In the barracks that night, heated discussions erupted in rapid Japanese. Some, like Yamada Hana from Kyoto, insisted the reports were exaggerations designed to justify American actions. Others, including Kiku, sat in stunned silence, their faith in everything they had believed visibly crumbling. Suzume sought out Dr. Hayes the next day, Lieutenant Chen translating her difficult questions. Were Japanese soldiers really so cruel to prisoners? Hayes looked at her with sad eyes and simply nodded. He showed her medical reports. He had written about American soldiers returned from Japanese captivity, documentation of malnutrition, disease, and abuse. He did not editorialize or condemn. He simply let the facts speak. The turning point came in early April when radio broadcasts announced the death of President Roosevelt. The women watched in confusion as their American captors openly grieved. Captain Mitchell's eyes were red when he addressed the camp that day. Guards who had shown them nothing but kindness now moved through their duties with heavy hearts. What struck Ayame most was what the Americans did not do. They did not blame the Japanese prisoners for their leader's death. They did not withdraw their kindness or become cruel in their grief. Instead, Corporal Reeves quietly explained to Ayame through simple English and gestures that Roosevelt had been a good man who wanted peace. The news came in waves throughout May and June, each wave more devastating than the last. Germany had surrendered in early May. The war in Europe was over, and American attention turned fully to the Pacific Theater. The reports grew increasingly dire for Japan. Firebombing raids over Tokyo, Okinawa fallen after brutal fighting, the home islands themselves now under direct attack. Ayame received her first letter from the International Red Cross in mid-June. Her hands shook so badly that Momoko had to help her open the envelope. The news was worse than she had feared. Her family home in Yokohama had been destroyed in an April firebombing raid. Her parents were listed as missing, presumed dead. Her younger brother, conscripted into service at age 16, had died defending Okinawa. She was alone. Everything she had left behind, everyone she had loved, was gone. The silk pouch she had carried since capture now held a photograph of people who no longer existed, memories of a life that had been reduced to ash and rubble. Around her, similar stories unfolded with heartbreaking repetition. Of the 50 women in the camp, 41 had now received Red Cross notifications. Only 6 had confirmed living family members. The rest faced the same devastating reality as Ayame, their homes destroyed, their families dead or scattered, their entire previous lives erased by the war they had believed was protecting those very things. Natsu learned that Nagasaki, her home city, was still standing but heavily damaged. Her parents were alive but struggling to survive in the ruins. They begged her to return home to help them rebuild. The letter should have brought relief, but instead, Natsu sat in the barracks sobbing. How could she return to help rebuild a country whose actions she was only now truly understanding? Kiku received no news at all from Hiroshima. The Red Cross could confirm nothing about her family, her neighborhood, or anyone she had known. The uncertainty was perhaps worse than confirmed death. She existed in a terrible limbo, not knowing whether to grieve or hope. Captain Mitchell watched his prisoners grapple with their losses and made a decision that went against standard protocol. He arranged for the women to gather in the recreation hall one evening, allowing them space to grieve together in their own language without American observation. Lieutenant Chen stood guard at the door, ensuring their privacy. Inside, the women wept openly for the first time since their capture. They sang songs from home, shared memories of families and places that no longer existed, and confronted the terrible question that none of them wanted to ask aloud. What were they returning to? Momoko spoke what many were thinking. Even if we go back, who are we now? We've lived among Americans for months. We've seen their kindness. We know now what our own military did. How do we return to Japan and pretend we don't know these things? August 6, 1945, brought news that stopped the world. The radio in Captain Mitchell's office crackled with reports of a new type of bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The descriptions were almost incomprehensible in their magnitude. an entire city devastated in a single blast, casualties estimated in the tens of thousands, a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. Kiku collapsed when she heard the name of her hometown. Lieutenant Chen caught her before she hit the floor, holding the young woman as she screamed in Japanese, words that needed no translation. Dr. Hayes sedated her, and for 3 days she remained in the infirmary, catatonic, with grief and shock. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. Natsu, who had been agonizing over her parents' pleas to return home, now had no home to return to. The city where she had grown up, where her family had begged her to help them rebuild, was gone. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, her entire decision had been rendered meaningless. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio waves, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. For the first time in recorded history, the emperor spoke directly to his people, his voice thin and distant, telling them to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. The Japanese women gathered in stunned silence to hear their emperor's words. Some wept. Others sat motionless, faces blank with shock. The empire they had served, the divine mission they had believed in, had ended not in glorious victory but in complete and utter defeat. Captain Mitchell gave them 3 days to process the news before calling them to assembly. The women gathered in the main hall on August 18th, knowing what was coming. Repatriation orders, the end of their time in American captivity, return to a Japan that no longer existed as they had known it. Mitchell stood before them, official documents in hand. His face showed the strain of the past weeks, the weight of command during these unprecedented times. "Ladies," he began, Lieutenant Chen translating his words into Japanese, "I have received orders from the War Department regarding your repatriation to Japan. Ships are being arranged to transport all prisoners of war back to their homeland. You will be processed through receiving centers before being released." He paused, looking at the faces before him. These were not the same frightened, defiant women who had arrived 7 months ago. They had been transformed by small kindnesses, by pork chops and applesauce, by Americans who had treated them with dignity when they expected only cruelty. What happened next would become legendary in the history of American prisoner of war operations. Ayami stood slowly, her legs shaking, but her voice steady. She had practiced these English words for hours, wanting to say them correctly, wanting there to be no misunderstanding. "Captain Mitchell," she said clearly, her accent heavy, but her meaning unmistakable. "Please, sir, some of us wish to make request." She looked back at the women behind her. Momoko stood, then Suzume, then Natsu, despite her grief, then 16 others. 19 women total, nearly half the camp's population. "We ask permission to stay in America." The silence that followed Ayame's words was absolute. Captain Mitchell stared at the Japanese women standing before him, certain he had misunderstood. Lieutenant Chen's face showed equal shock. In the entire history of American military operations, prisoners of war did not request to remain in enemy captivity. They demanded release, fought for repatriation, sought every means to return home. Yet here stood 19 Japanese women asking for the exact opposite. "I need to make sure I understand correctly," Mitchell said slowly, waiting for Chen's translation. "You wish to remain here rather than return to Japan?" Ayami nodded, then spoke in her careful English, supplemented by Chen's translation, for the more complex thoughts. "Captain, we know this is an unusual request, but Japan we serve no longer exists. Families mostly gone, cities destroyed. More than this, we learned terrible truths about our country's actions. We discovered kindness where we expected cruelty." Momoko stepped forward, adding her own halting English. "Here, we are treated with dignity. Given choice, given respect. We fear what waits in Japan, not just destruction, but shame. We were captured. We lived with Americans. We will be seen as failures, as traitors for not dying, rather than surrendering." Suzume spoke next, her voice barely above a whisper. "We want chance to become better people than we were. America showed us this is possible." The other women who remained seated, those who had chosen repatriation, looked at their friends with expressions mixing understanding and pain. This moment was splitting them into two groups, two different futures, two different answers to the same impossible question about where home truly was. One of them, Watanabe Ume from Osaka, stood to speak for those choosing to return. "We understand our sisters who wish to stay," she said in Japanese, Chen translating. "But Japan needs us. Our country is broken, and broken things need people willing to help mend them. We must go back, not to the Japan that was, but to help build the Japan that could be." Her words carried no judgment, only conviction. She looked at Ayame with tears in her eyes. "What you learned here about kindness, about treating enemies with dignity, Japan needs to learn these lessons too. Some of us must carry them home." Captain Mitchell found himself facing a situation with no precedent and no clear protocol. "I need to send this up the chain of command," he said finally. "This decision is beyond my authority. But I want you all to understand, those who wish to stay, the path will not be easy. You will no longer be prisoners of war, but you also will not automatically become American citizens. You will need sponsors, employment, places to live. You will face suspicion and prejudice from Americans who lost family members fighting Japan." Ayame met his eyes steadily. "We understand, Captain. Difficult path is better than no path at all. In Japan, we have no future. Here, maybe we can build one." Mitchell nodded slowly. "I'll send the request to Washington tonight. But I need to know, what made you certain this was the right choice?" Ayame's answer was simple. "Pork chops and applesauce, Captain, and everything that came after." 25 years later, summer of 1970. Takahashi Ayame. Henderson stood in the Wisconsin sunshine outside what had once been Camp McCoy, now transformed into Fort McCoy, a permanent military installation. She was no longer the frightened 24-year-old prisoner who had arrived in the frozen January of 1945. She was now 49, an American citizen, a translator for the State Department, and the wife of Thomas Henderson, the son of the family who had first sponsored her release from the camp. Beside her stood Nakamura Momoko Chen, who had married Lieutenant Sarah Chen's brother and become a registered nurse at the Mayo Clinic. Hayashi Suzume Walsh had married Sergeant Thomas Walsh and raised 3 children while working as a teacher of Japanese language and culture. Tanaka Natsu had never married, dedicating her life instead to social work, helping refugees and displaced persons find new homes in America. They had returned for a reunion, 25 years after the day they made their unprecedented choice. The camp was hosting a ceremony honoring the unique chapter in its history, when 19 Japanese women chose captivity over freedom, transformation over return. Of the 19 who had stayed, 17 had built successful lives in America. 2 had eventually returned to Japan in the 1950s, feeling called to help in their homeland's reconstruction, but carrying with them the lessons of American kindness. Of the 31 who had chosen immediate repatriation in 1945, many had become leaders in building the new democratic Japan, advocates for reconciliation between former enemies. Kiku, whose family had been lost in Hiroshima, stood with them now. She had stayed in America, earned a degree in art therapy, and spent her career helping trauma survivors heal. She never spoke of her lost family without tears, but she had transformed her grief into purpose. Captain Mitchell, now retired Brigadier General Mitchell, addressed the gathering. His hair had gone white, but his eyes still held the same kindness Ayame remembered from that first shocking dinner of pork chops and applesauce. "What happened here 25 years ago taught us something vital about the American spirit," he said. "We learned that our greatest strength is not in how we treat our friends, but in how we treat our enemies." These women arrived as prisoners. They left as proof that human beings can choose to become better than what war made them. Ayami had been asked to speak, and she approached the podium carrying the same silk pouch she had clutched on her first day in captivity. Inside was the photograph of her lost family, now accompanied by new photographs of her American husband, their 2 children, and the life she had built from the ashes of everything she had lost. "We were taught that Americans were devils," she said, her English now flawless after 25 years. "We learned instead that devils exist not in nationality, but in ideology, not in race, but in the choice to see others as less than human. That first meal of pork chops and applesauce was more than food. It was proof that our enemies saw us as people who deserved kindness even when we had served a cause that showed none." She paused, looking at the faces before her, both American and Japanese, former prisoners and former guards, now simply friends united by shared history.